Welcome to our interview today. My name is Marianne Kannengieser, and with me is Jon Gamble from Australia. I'm very happy to have him here today as a specialist for the chronic fatigue syndrome. And yes, Jon, could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'm Jon Gamble from the Southern Highlands in Australia, which is kind of halfway between Sydney and Canberra in the country. And I've been in practice for 30 years. I've written quite a few books in that time, 3 practitioner books, and also books for lay people. I'm currently working on I hope to be my last book at the moment. It's a long one. So what I'm talking about today is what I'm writing in the book as well.
That is great. So the chronic fatigue syndrome is a larger topic than most people know. When I first met the chronic fatigue syndrome and let's say diseases accompanying that, the interesting points of view on that I heard from the Russian people, from the Russian doctors, because they said behind the chronic fatigue syndrome, first look for viral diseases. And this is the same you said to me.
Yes.
And this is where my mind went, wow. First time I heard it from the Russians, second time I heard it from you. So please tell us more about that.
All right, well, let me just take 2 steps back from that, and I'll come back to the virus issue. So the first thing, so we're addressing homeopaths, right? So
homeopaths and laymen.
And laymen, yeah, okay. So we have to always start with the first page of the organon, as I said to you earlier, which is aphorism 3 in particular, which talks all about find the fundamental cause of the disease. And this is particularly true for something like chronic fatigue syndrome, because it is not one entity. It is many different entities or many different circumstances or events or pathogens that have coalesced to cause the syndrome we call chronic fatigue syndrome. So then one person's chronic fatigue syndrome is different to the second person's chronic fatigue syndrome. There's no 2 alike, really. So as long as you get that in your head, when treating chronic fatigue syndrome, because if you just give a symptomatic remedy, that is a remedy based on totality of symptoms, you more often than not fail in your treatment. I learned the hard way. I failed many times when I first started practice until I realized about the first page of the organon. Because as homeopaths, when we get out of college, all we want to do is find the remedy, you know, when the patient comes in. We're already looking through the repertory before the patient's even sat down. So you've got to stop doing that if you're treating chronic fatigue syndrome. You've got to first understand what it is you are treating.
Yes.
If you don't have that at the beginning, you get lost. So that's aphorism 3. What are we treating? What is the fundamental cause? Sometimes there is only one cause, and that's relatively simple. Other times, with chronic cases, people who have been suffering for many years, there are a multitude of causes, so you have to unravel them. So I like to boil down the causes into 3 groups, which covers most things, and that is toxicity, deficiency, and infection. All right? I like to boil down into those 3 groups because all of the causes of chronic fatigue syndrome can be found in one or more of those groups. So let's start with your first question, which is viruses. So this is the most simple of all the types of chronic fatigue syndrome to treat, the most simple. And this is where the patient comes in and says, I was perfectly well until I had that virus. So it might be infectious mononucleosis, Epstein-Barr virus, or some other similar kind of virus where the patient was in bed for more than a week and had very slow recovery. And that may have been years ago. And they say, periodically, I feel like I'm coming down with the virus, but it never actually comes on to much. I get swollen glands, a slightly sore throat, and then it goes away again. But all the while, I'm always tired. I always have brain fog. I wake unrefreshed despite having reasonable sleep, all these things. The most important part is they're never well since having the virus. So here in Australia, we've combined 4 nosodes into one remedy. We call it antiviral JG, JG as in Jon Gamble, and it's made for us by a pharmacy here in Australia. And it contains, if my memory serves me, it contains the Epstein-Barr virus and Coxsackie virus, A and B, influenzae, and cytomegalovirus.
Reasonable.
Most of the people we see here, it's the cytomegalovirus or something similar to that, which has caused the chronic fatigue.
In Austria, it would normally be the Epstein-Barr virus. So is this remedy only available in Australia?
It can be imported anywhere in the world by the pharmacy. So it's very important when we give the remedy, and I must say this works most of the time for most of these people, unless there's some other factor. But if they say, I was perfectly well until I had the virus, then we're fairly confident, 95% confident, that's all they're going to need. So we give them 10 doses of 30C, and then we give them a further 10 doses of 200C. And for most of those people, by the time they've completed those 20 doses, all their symptoms have gone. But the important point is you have to expect aggravation with the first few doses. So we always tell them to dilute the medicine in water and just sip or by olfaction or whatever you like to dilute it, the first few doses. Otherwise, they get quite a nasty aggravation. So these people are usually in their late teens through the 20s into the early 30s. This is the kind of patient we see with this kind of chronic fatigue syndrome.
I just wanted to ask you a question. One was the water solution, because I thought that the remedy might lead to aggravation. And the second is what you just said. Normally, you find these symptoms in clients till they are 30. From the Russians, I heard that later on, the virus passes on to deeper tissue.
Yes.
And then
it causes more trouble.
Yeah, and then they are going for other remedies and other therapy. What are you doing with that?
Well, if someone has had one of these viruses for more than, for more than 2 decades, it's going to enmesh itself with other things by then. It's not so simple. So you have to unpick it. Just like unpicking a ball of wool that's all tangled up. You've got to unpick it to see what it is. And more often in these cases, the medical tests don't show you anything. Yeah. What shows you the answers are carefully going over the patient timeline. Because other things have happened to the patient along the way, apart from the virus.
Usually. From the Russians, I heard that they usually get them with rheumatoid arthritis and a bit heightened liver enzymes and a bit heightened CRP.
If they've got rheumatoid arthritis, then you've got to think about co-infections, principally streptococcal infections are very relevant to rheumatoid arthritis. Okay. So you've got a virus infection and a bacterial infection, co-infections.
So we have the primary infection, then due to the weak immune system, the secondary infections on top. Okay, I understand.
Unless the patient had a history of streptococcal infection when they were a child, if they were having recurring strep throats, for example, then that's preceding the virus, because the virus comes in your teens normally. That's preceding the virus. So the virus has enmeshed itself onto the streptococcal infection.
This is what we see in the Swedish children normally, in the so-called ear children.
Yes. So then you need different treatments, 2 different treatments.
Very.
That isn't to say that you won't have a similimum that will suit the patient, but you still have to give a remedy that's going to deactivate the pathogen itself, and that's why we use the nosodes.
So do you use nosodes for the streptococcus and staphylococcus as well?
Yeah, streptococcinum. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Germany, I know about streptococcus nosodes in very low potency, let's say C6, C5. What do you use in Australia?
We do the opposite. We start at 200 and we go up to sometimes up to 50 and we'll CM very high.
Oh, very interesting.
Mm.
It's so interesting to talk to other nationalities, other countries, and see how they do it.
Now that you've told me that, I'm going to try 6C next time and see what I get with that.
It's the tradition here. It's you even have quite normal pharmacies doing the streptococcus nosodes in very low potency.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we even have the bacteria itself in combination streptococcus and staphylococcus.
Yes.
In nearly no potency, only diluted as stimulants for the immune system.
Yes, thank you. I might try that myself.
So great talking. And you said the viral thing is one track into the chronic fatigue. What about the toxins?
Well, the toxins, there are quite a few things to think about. One is, of course, heavy metals, particularly mercury in people who have been unwell for many decades, because mercury creates hypersensitivity. And you've also got copper, which is not a heavy metal, it's a nutritional element, but when it's in excess, it becomes toxic, neurotoxic. And then you've got lead. So those are the three principal things you can see in chronic fatigue syndrome if you're talking about heavy metals or the elements. But you've also got chemicals. If the patient has been around industrial chemicals or pesticides, grew up on a farm where there was lots of Roundup being used or something like that, sometimes even more so-called benign household chemicals like the phthalates or the bisphenol A in your personal care products. Those things can affect you. Sometimes the chemicals are prescribed pharmaceuticals. Botox, for example, is one that I'm currently writing about at the moment. I've just been writing about a new type of chronic fatigue which comes with people who have had Botox injections.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So all these are different kinds of toxicity.
So the first is obvious old dental things with mercury?
Mercury, yes, probably in my age group, we all were given mercury-based tooth amalgams when we were children. So if you've had those in your mouth for many decades, the jury is out really, but most dentists would agree that they start to degrade after 20 years. So if you've had them in your mouth for more than 20 years, then without exception, you would have a high mercury load.
Yeah, definitely.
And mercury picks away at your health in a very insidious way by undermining your nutritionals. So when you have toxicity, such as with mercury, you also have deficiency, particularly selenium and iodine are affected by mercury.
I understand.
So that's why in high mercury patients, you'll often see endocrine disturbance, particularly thyroid.
Naturally. So the second ones, copper and lead, are the water pipes?
Copper, yes, I think, I don't know about in Germany, but in Australia, as in many countries, they put fluoride in the drinking water, and the fluoride reacts with the copper pipes and extracts copper particles from the copper pipes. But the other problem is, in Australia, the soil is very deficient in zinc. Okay. So many of our population have undiagnosed zinc deficiency. If you have very low zinc, then the naturally occurring copper in your food or in your drinking water, which is not naturally occurring, accumulates and becomes neurotoxic.
I understand. And toxic for the liver as well.
Toxic for the liver, that's right. It causes partial obstruction of the biliary tree, so that affects your digestion and your detoxification pathway.
Yeah. Very interesting. And then you went for this terrible Roundup, the glyphosate. It's a walking death, I think.
Yes, everybody should be buying organic food where they can.
Yeah. Buying or growing it themselves, even on the balcony, is better than eating something like that. What is the Roundup issue with wheat in Australia?
Yes, it's sprayed on wheat, definitely. And I've read some articles which suggest that Roundup exposure predisposes you to celiac disease.
Yeah. This is what I was asking, what I was about to ask next, whether you see glyphosate and celiac in combination.
We can't prove it necessarily, but I've certainly read articles which are suggesting that glyphosate predisposes, if you're genetically predisposed to celiac disease, it can activate it.
So that takes us to the deficiency, because in patients who have high exposure to glyphosate or eat a lot of wheat with glyphosate in it, they tend to get the leaky gut syndrome.
No, yes, which you also get with mercury. That's right. And once you get the leaky gut, then of course, not only are you becoming malnourished, as you've just suggested, but also if your gut isn't working properly, then your detoxification pathway isn't working properly either. And so, particularly with things like mold, mycotoxins, for example, if you've got a high load of mold toxins in your liver, then if you've got a leaky gut, every time the bile comes down to digest your food, rather than the molds leaving your body through your gut, it's reabsorbed through the leaky gut. So it's very hard to get rid of the mold biotoxins.
Yeah.
So we started with the most simple or straightforward treatments with the post-viral syndromes. The other end of the spectrum is people who have got high mercury for many decades and have got mold exposure. So you've got all this toxicity plus the damage being caused by the mold biotoxins as well and the leaky gut. So there's a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, those clients are not easy. And I just wonder whether you see the same as I observed, that those clients sooner or later go for neurological diseases.
Oh, yes. They're going to be more prone to them because both mercury and the mycotoxins, the mold toxins, are neurotoxic.
So do you see an alignment with those clients and ALS or MS?
I haven't seen enough ALS patients. I've only seen a handful of patients with ALS, and we didn't see heavy metals, but we found mycotoxins in 2 of those cases. So I think mold mycotoxins are a big deal with ALS, at least the patients I've seen.
Okay, because I wonder what it is why we have such an amount of ALS and MS clients at the moment. The numbers are getting higher and higher. It has to do something with toxicity or G4, G5 or something like that.
Yeah, chemical exposure often, I think with MS, I've certainly seen that in quite a few cases with MS, where they've grown up on farms, or one case where they were market gardeners, and so they were always spraying their greens with whatever they were spraying them with, some kind of pesticide, and they would be eating their greens every day from their own market garden. So those kinds of cases, I've seen MS in those cases, and in the same siblings, I've seen MS. So you know it's something environmental or toxic, and it's in the same siblings.
Very interesting.
So we also have our own cocktail for detoxification of pesticides and insecticides. We call it Protocol 1, and it contains homeopathic doses in low potency of huge range of these pesticides and insecticides, all mixed together, called Protocol 1. And we give that to patients over a long period of time in ascending potencies, in addition to whatever other treatment we give them.
So you start at, let's say, C3, or what? Where do you start?
No, we couldn't get them into the country if they were below 12C, because then there'd be chemistry in them. So we had to start above 12C. So they start at 16C, and then I had them made by a pharmacy. So they start at 16C, and then you can also get them in 30C, and you can get them also in 200C. The same pharmacy that makes my viral no-sode mix makes these up for me.
Okay, and you go just as we go with the how is it called? The Viscom album therapy, where we go in just slow heightening. You do it the same. Quite often potent, quite often in water.
Every second day.
Okay.
Every second day. So one day on, one day off. So there's a rest in between, in addition to whatever similimum or whatever other treatment we give.
Okay. Do you see aggravations in those clients?
I see viral aggravations, and I expect them. I don't often see aggravations with the chemical detoxes, because usually it's so long ago when they were exposed to them. If it was a recent exposure, there might be. But because it's so long ago, maybe 3 decades ago, we give it. What people say is the aggravation is a bad taste in the mouth, or feeling very tired that day, or a very slight headache for a little while. Not extreme, just very subtle.
Do they go for sleeplessness?
Do these patients have sleeplessness?
Yeah.
I don't think sleeplessness is necessarily a symptom caused by these toxins, but they might have it for some other reason.
So
mostly I give these chemical detoxes in patients with severe pathologies like cancer, or neurological diseases like the ones you've mentioned, if there's been an exposure. So as in MS, I mostly use them.
Okay, I understand.
One case we had a man who, as a child, was exposed to the cyanide gas in Bhopal in 1984, I think it was, or 86. He was only a 3-year-old child at the time. And he had breathlessness and fatigue, but it wasn't caused either through cardiac examination or respiratory examination. In other words, the medical tests returned normal. But that was one of the symptoms of those gases in Bhopal. So many years, 3 decades later, he's in his late 30s, he started to get these symptoms. So we used these same chemical detoxes for him, and that successfully treated his breathlessness and his fatigue. And then his children, who were not born at the time, had delayed development. And one of the effects of the cyanide gases in Bhopal was delayed development in children. So we used the same chemical detoxes for his children when they were little, just 4 years of age, even though they weren't there at the time, because they've inherited the toxic burden from their father. And that was effective in helping their developmental delay. So again, you see, it's the timeline that's the most important. What's happened to the patient? What's happened to their parents?
This is very interesting to see that that those toxins and chemicals have influences over generations.
Yes, they do. And same with the heavy metals, can also be inherited, particularly copper can be inherited from one generation to the next. So all the kids who have got ADHD and OCD and all those behavioral and learning problems, more than 80% of them have got high copper.
Oh, I didn't know about that. Thank you for that information.
Mm. So therefore, when we're treating children with ADHD, we choose their similimum, whatever that might be. Let's say, I don't know, let's say we give them Kali Brom because they're getting night terrors, right? But we see that they've got high copper. We've tested and we've seen high copper. We give them what we call copper chelate, which is a potency cord of cuprum metallicum, 6C, 12C, 30C, 200C, all mixed together by the lab into one remedy, a potency cord. So we give them Kali Brom on one day, and then we give them the copper chelate on this alternate day, plus one zinc supplement. Because remember, zinc and copper are antagonists. And that's how we treat ADHD or OCD or night terrors in children with high copper.
Did you find things like that on the other side of the spectrum for the autistic people?
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. Because OCD and ADHD are just the bottom end of the whole spectrum. Yes. But you see a lot more than copper. So the higher up the spectrum you go, so the more disabled the child, the more pathologies there are. So they may well have high copper as well, but there'll be other things as well. You've got to look for the things that are more subtle. So like the Roundup we were talking about, whether they've had Roundup exposure, whether they've had paracetamol exposure, what happened to their parents.
And vaccinations.
Go back for more. Vaccinations. So that's more toxicity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or in one case we had recently, the parent of the autistic child had a bad reaction to a vaccine as a child. So they didn't give that vaccine to the child, but we still gave the Homeopathic vaccine detox to the child, even though they didn't get the vaccine, on the basis the mother had the reaction to the vaccine when she was a child, and it had a positive effect. So even a vaccine influence can be passed from one generation to the next. It's really Hahnemann's miasms in a different guise. It's still just miasms, an inherited burden from your parent, right? It can be more than just psychosis and syphilis and SORA. Any influence that can affect the DNA can be inherited.
Yes, then we have to think of any virus as a possible miasm, especially RNA viruses.
Any pathology which is capable of embedding itself or affecting the DNA in some way can be inherited. Anything.
Okay, very interesting. You said a deficiency was the third column.
Deficiency. So where you have toxicity, you always have deficiency. So one of the ways you combat toxicity is to make sure you correct the deficiency. So in all the children with ADHD, they're all going to be low in zinc. They need their zinc. Some of them might be low in iodine. You get developmental delay if there's low iodine. If you've got high mercury, you're going to be low, most probably, in your selenium and your iodine. If you've got high cadmium, you're going to be low in zinc. If you've got high aluminium, you're going to be low in silica. So you always have to address the antagonistic mineral balance when you've got a heavy metal.
So there's a lot to think about. When you look at a chronic fatigue client aged, let's say 50, 40, then you have to check out the career of the chronic fatigue syndrome, where in reality it did start, and it could have started in the parents.
Yes, that's right. So with our entry form, with chronic fatigue, we get people to go through every year of their life and write down what happened in every year of their life. But for autism, we get the parents to write down what happened in every year of their life as well. We want to know about that, because sometimes the answer lies there.
It's very interesting. Very, very interesting.
I call it, I called it miasm before, but what I call it that people can understand is phantom toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
People understand the word phantom like a ghost. It's not really there because you can't find it in tests. You can't test for an inherited, toxic burden, but we can see it in the timeline. So it's a phantom. It's invisible, but it's still there. So we still treat it as though it's there. And if there's a positive reaction, we know.
It's so interesting because this is exactly what the Russians say. It's so interesting. They found the same thing, not coming from the homeopathic side. They did come from their testing of clients by computer.
Mm-hmm.
And from the resonance field things, but they're talking exactly about the same experiences.
That's really good to know.
So interesting to see that even if you come from different lines of science or experience, you come down to the same conclusion.
Good. That's as it should be.
Yes, this is as it should be, but still it's fascinating.
If we are unprejudiced observers, then that's as it should be.
What is your advice for people with chronic fatigue syndrome?
Oh, well, as I said at the beginning, chronic fatigue syndrome is many, many different things. So there's not one piece of advice to give, except to say, find a practitioner who seems to know what he's doing to help you. And no, actually, what my advice would be is this. Because most people with chronic fatigue syndrome, the medical tests all come back normal, right? So their doctor can think that they're neurotic, or they need an antidepressant, or they're malingering, making it up, right? And all that can be very psychologically damaging to the patient. They can even begin to doubt themselves when there's nothing to see, the medical tests are normal, the patient themselves can start to think that they're going crazy. So my advice to the CFS patients is you're not going crazy and you don't need an antidepressant. What you need is to find someone who understands chronic fatigue syndrome, and that may not be your doctor.
This is right. This is what I have seen in fibromyalgia patients all over the planet. It's so hard to diagnose, and it's so hard to find somebody who understands it and knows how to treat it.
Yes. Yes. Well, fibromyalgia comes often with a very severe chronic fatigue syndrome, which is called CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, which is an extremely painful, debilitating form of chronic fatigue syndrome. And often with CIRS, you have the mold biotoxins, the mycotoxins. But other cases of fibromyalgia, I've seen the same viruses again that we talked about before. It's a post-viral syndrome as well.
Did you see it as post-traumatic?
Oh, yes, well? Yes. Sometimes there's been a particular trauma that has actualized whatever the disease is, and it started from there. So in that case, you would say, I suppose you'd have to say the patient has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's combined with whatever are the other elements of their chronic fatigue syndrome. But I wouldn't say chronic fatigue syndrome alone arises psychologically from psychological trauma. There's another factor there as well.
Okay. So
if it's just psychological trauma, then it's PTSD.
Okay. For it to be able to be a chronic fatigue syndrome, it at least has to have a virus in the background.
A toxicity, a deficiency, or an infection. One of those three.
One of those. Did we forget about something?
Well, I can talk to you all night about chronic fatigue
Yeah,
syndrome. We've only
I
just scratched the
can.
surface, but that's the bare bones of it.
Yeah, yeah. I know that we only scratched the surface, and I already learned a lot. And what I really realized is that the Russians and you are on coming from different points of view to the same conclusion. This was
Very good.
very interesting.
That's very interesting.
Very
Yes.
interesting.
Mm.
This is the major adventure of the day. And to know that you have different nosodes, which I didn't know about,
Mm.
and now know that they exist in Australia, and that
Yeah.
people can just connect to you if their practitioners needs to get those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is very, very good. So, any final words?
No, I think that's enough. I'm very impressed that you can speak Russian.
I do not speak Russian, but I
Oh.
know Russians who can speak English.
Oh, okay.
Well, I speak a little bit of Russian, or at least I understand a bit of it. And it's
Very good.
not in reality no complicated language. The complicated language is Greek.
Greek. Yes.
This
Well,
is
I hope
the
you've learned some
task of this
Greek by
work.
now.
Hmm?
I hope you've learned some Greek by now, living there.
I'm living here now for 2.5 years, and I learned a bit, but it's very hard. It's very hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And any other language I met in my life is easier. Jon, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Good luck with your project.
And I'm thinking of doing some live talks. And can I address you for one of the live talks in September?
So would that be like with questions and answers? People can
Uh,
ask questions and answers, or how would it be?
just 3 or 4 speakers in a live talk, just interdisciplinary talk, and maybe we stream it live on Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope so that people can ask through the chat.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
That would be very nice.
Okay.
Jon, thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.